Described as the second insurgency, corruption comes back to haunt the Iraqi government. An annual report from the Public Integrity Commission goes after 16 senior officials, hard on the heels of the resignation of the Minister of Trade. Is it all a serious attempt to eradicate corruption or a cosmetic move to improve Prime Minister al-Maliki's image? Iraq amid war and corruption. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. The world's most corrupt countries. Now there's a list best avoided, but Iraq not only made it onto the list, it's in the top 3. And this a country already plagued with war, terror, poverty and some say weak governance. But the annual report from Iraq's anti-corruption group, it's called the Public Integrity Commission, has revealed how grave and at some levels ingrained the problem really is. It is seen at all levels and almost all ministries, defence, interior, finance, education, health, all accused of being corrupt at some point. In fact, in this 2008 report, 16 high-level government officials have been named and shamed, along with arrest warrants being issued in their names. And just last week, you might remember the Iraqi Trade Minister, Abdul Falah Sudani, submitted his resignation over corruption allegations. His ministry was accused of accepting bribes in return for contracts relating to food imports. Some of the officials involved, including Sudani's 2 brothers, one of whom was arrested, the other vanished. And in revealing this annual report, the head of the Public Integrity Commission had some pretty extraordinary figures for the assembled media in Baghdad.
The total number of corruption complaints received by the Commission since it was founded until the end of 2008 has reached 17,610 cases. The investigating judges went through 12,975 cases. 937 cases of those were forwarded to the criminal court. The number of convictions reached 396, including 5 former ministers.
All right, let's bring in our guests now to discuss this. In Baghdad is Saad al-Muttalibi. He is a political advisor at the Ministry of National Dialogue and Reconciliation. In Zurich is Mark Piet, the chairman of the bribery working group at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. He was also on the independent inquiry into the oil for food program of the UN in Iraq. And rounding out our panel in London is Sabah Jawad. He is from the group Iraqi Democrats Against Occupation. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Mark Piet, I'd come to you first in Zurich, and I hope my phone's not going to start ringing off the hook after this, but I feel like saying that you're talking about corruption in politics, you're almost, anywhere in the world I should say, you're almost talking about the grass being green or the sky being blue. It's accepted, people know it's there, it's all over the place. What makes it any different and any worse in Iraq?
Well, good evening. I think the NGO Transparency International is right that the situation in Iraq is particularly difficult. Obviously, we all know about the difficulties of Iraq on a different level, bloodshed over years, over decades, and no wonder there is a very high level of corruption. But what is interesting is that it's not the individual small public official or civil servant. It's right from the top, and this is now increasingly being recognized.
Sabah Jawad in London, I think it might be important for us, and I'll get the views of you and our other guests, but important for us to define what exactly corruption means in the Iraqi situation. Is it simply the embezzling of funds, the misuse of funds? When you say corruption in Iraq, what would you specifically refer to?
I think it contains all these elements, embezzlement, corruption, taking bribes and misuse of public funds as well. We've seen many examples in the past 6 years of the occupation. In fact, the occupation fosters such practices. We have many examples at the beginning of the occupation where millions and billions of Iraqi funds, public funds, has been disappeared. We know the case of 9 billion Iraqi dollars transferred to Iraq by airplane that was in cash and disappeared from this planet. And when some people raised the questions even in the US Congress, officials in the USA said this is not taxpayers' money, American taxpayers' money. So this process has been going on for a long time. There are many people who've been accused, in fact ministers and high-ranking officials been accused of corruption, some taking bribes and squandering millions, hundreds of millions of Iraqi pounds, none of them being brought to account yet. In fact, they all live happily, spending their ill-gotten money in Iraq, and they live abroad, one in the United States and another one in Jordan, and
okay, so
the trade
all
minister will probably end up in London.
Bearing all that in mind, let's get a reaction, to be fair, from Saad al-Mutalibi in Baghdad, who is a political advisor himself. What is your definition of corruption, especially bearing in mind what our other two guests have just outlined for us?
Well, first, good evening, and thank you for having me today.
You're welcome.
To start with, I think we are very proud to have such a transparent system that we can actually pinpoint corruption and pinpoint mismanagement, and therefore we can deal with it. On many levels in regional countries, we find corruption and embezzlement and mismanagement of funds and mismanagement in general being hidden, and nobody hears about it. We are on the right course of finding the causes of the mismanagement in Iraq. As you very well know, we have a very complex political situation or environment in Iraq. Living in a democratic environment, political parties forced their ministers on the government. The government, the prime minister, is not free to choose his ministers, hence he's not free to deal with the ministers. Therefore, there is another body, the Integrity Commission, that deals with all embezzlement or corruption at all levels. The Prime Minister was very clear in his last command to make sure that all persons involved in corruption, whatever political affiliation they belong to, they will be challenged, they will be brought to justice.
And with that in mind,
it is a phenomenon.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to bring in, I'll let you continue in a moment. I just want to bring you these numbers again, and for our viewers and our other guests, because these were the numbers which were brought to us earlier by the head of the inquiry. 17,610 complaints against government bodies that was received by the committee by the end of 2008. So 17,000 there. Of those, not even 1,000, 937 went to court, and of those, there were 396 convictions. So, Mr. Saad, we're talking about 396 convictions out of 17,000 cases. How are we to view that? As in, there's only a small number of corrupt people out of all those 1,000, or that there were thousands of cases and a whole lot of them slipped through the cracks?
No, the fact is, the 17,000 doesn't indicate there are 17,000 cases of embezzlement or corruption. There were 17,000 reports. On many occasions, these reports are found out after investigation to be false reports for whatever reason, mainly political struggle within the parliament and within the political entities in the parliament. Everybody is using every mean available to discredit the government. And this is a democracy we live in, and the democratic process requires the government to be responsible for its ministers, where in fact the prime minister cannot deal with his ministers, cannot replace the ministers. At present, he is trying to make a cabinet amendment, and all political entities refuse to allow the prime minister to judge their ministers, even if they were corrupt or even if they were inefficient in running their ministries. The 17,000 doesn't indicate 17, as I said, 17,000 of corruption. These are reports. Of those, the cases, they were all investigated, by the way. Out of those, a number was declared to be a true embezzlement or true mismanagement of funds or true mismanagement. Hence, they were taken to court.
Okay, let's move back to Mark Piet. Thank you for that. Move back to Mark Piet in Zurich. Saad there was mentioning ministers, the problems that Nouri al-Maliki has had with replacing ministers. He's got one to replace at the moment, of course, the Minister of Trade who resigned earlier in the week. What do you think happened there? I mean, he's effectively fallen on his sword, although there are no official charges against him. How's that all viewed in your view?
Well, I probably have to react to two things that have been said just a moment ago.
Sure.
On the one hand, it has been said that the administration after the occupation, after 2003, contributed considerably or let things go on and contributed to corruption. And I think that's right. Especially the occupation forces were not bothered by corruption, or their companies, their people working for them actually contributed to the corruption in Iraq. I think that is fair to be said. Now the question is, how do you interpret what is happening at the moment? It's obviously difficult from outside to give you an opinion. My initial reaction was it felt very impressive. I was impressed that they managed actually to get rid of a minister who probably had a lot to account for. But the question is obviously, is the situation so untenable that there was no alternative?
And Sabah Jawad in London, your view on what happened with this minister?
Well, I mean, the spokesman from Baghdad, the spokesman for the government, has stated that actually al-Maliki has no power because the political groups that the ministers belong to prevent him from doing something about them. But in fact, if you take the case of the trade minister, the trade minister belongs to a party which used to be Al-Dawa party. Even so, they split from Al-Dawa party. So he had the power, actually, and nobody was forcing him from other political groups not to do something about it. And in fact, the conduct of the Prime Minister in the past few days also indicate the way he handled these kind of things. I think the upper hand in Iraq is not actually with the Prime Minister or the political system. This belongs to the American. The American fostered corruption from the beginning, and they started with the Iraqi opposition group against the regime of Saddam Hussein. They corrupted a lot of political groups and so on. They started the occupation by corrupting a lot of elements within the Iraqi society, and they encourage this because they want Iraq to be fragmented, weak, and disorganized, and corruption rule, basically. This is serves the interests of the occupation, and they will continue to do this. So let us also remember that another minister was accused of embezzlement of hundreds of millions of pounds, and in fact he was smuggled out of Iraq, and now he lives in the United States. He was smuggled out of Iraq with the American troops, in fact, immediately after he was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment because of his crime committed against public fund. So you see a direct hand for the American occupation in all this. The recent acceptance of the Prime Minister resignation of the Trade Minister, before he faced the music in Parliament, there is an intention to put a motion of no confidence in him and the legal procedures against him.
To be fair,
in fact,
though,
it seems that accepting the retirement of the resignation of the Trade Minister takes him off the hooks, basically. And sooner or later you find this guy, which has a dual nationality, British and Iraqi nationality, probably living in London, spending the money he got.
To be fair, though, Nouri al-Maliki has more recently admitted himself, had to admit, that corruption is one of the country's biggest problems after downplaying it for a while. He's now saying it does need to be confronted. He's even suggested launching a campaign against corruption. What we should look at is the context of that and why that change might have come about. I guess it suggests two things. One, he's become aware that Iraqis are increasingly disillusioned with the authorities, and two, that corruption would be a pivotal issue in parliamentary elections expected by the end of the year. In short, if he and his party want to remain in power, then he needs to be tackling corruption head-on, and he needs to do it now rather than in a run-up to an election. Saad al-Muttalibi in Baghdad. I'm trying not to be too cynical here, though as a journalist I think it's my job half the time. We can't ignore this as a factor, a crackdown on corruption in the lead up to a general election where his popularity is waning.
It doesn't work like this.
Really?
This is an issue that it has been plaguing Iraqi society for over 35 years. This has not resulted out of the occupation. This is a phenomenon that started with the Ba'ath Party taking power in Iraq and bringing those that are close to the family, close to the ex-leadership, and started the whole process of corruption in Iraq. So it's not a new phenomenon to start with. Yes, I agree. There were escalation of this phenomenon after the liberation of Iraq. And I hope Mr. Sabah visits Baghdad and not stay most of his time in London to see things from close and to see the amount of work that has been done. And to talk about the Americans this way, we really do not care what the Americans say or do in Baghdad anymore. We are now a sovereign country. The Americans cannot interfere in any of Iraqi affairs at the moment. If we feel there is a minister or a director general or somebody who is playing offside, he will definitely be brought to justice. And by the way, another point Mr. Sabah has mentioned, the Parliament's job is to vote of no confidence. The Parliament's job is not to bring people to justice. That is the justice system, which is completely independent in Iraq. The justice system follows up on matters of any type of breaking the law, and they deal with criminals in Iraq, or they deal with suspects in Iraq. So the Parliament's duty is to withdraw to make a vote of no confidence if the numbers add up, and then another department deal with it. So Maliki accepted his resignation, or did not get him off the hook. If he is guilty, he is to be tried in a court. That is not the job for the Parliament, and definitely not the job for Maliki.
Okay, I'd like to challenge one more thing there. I'd like to challenge one more thing there, because you talk about what the justice system does. I'd like everyone to have a listen to something from Radi Khaza al-Radi. He is the former head of the Iraqi Public Integrity Commission. Now, he was assigned the task of fighting corruption. In doing so, he obtained an arrest warrant for the former Minister of Defence. He launched investigations against 20 current and former ministers. But as you're going to hear now, that appeared to backfire on him.
The Commission on Public Integrity has succeeded in achieving its objectives as an independent body. It treated all citizens equally under the Constitution, and I can say that the Commission has successfully handed down 241 sentences against corrupt officials. But when the government saw that the Commission was adamant to combat corruption seriously, it started to point the finger of blame at us and accuse us of being corrupt, simply because we seek integrity, we seek independence, and we treat all Iraqis on equal footing. Therefore, I should conclude that the false accusations against us are a proof of our integrity.
Mark Pieth, you've got to question justice and political transparency when the Anti-Corruption Commission gets accused of being corrupt, surely?
Yes. Well, I readily accept that I'm the outsider in this game here. I've never been actually in Baghdad. My background is a different one. I've looked into what happened during the Oil for Food program, and we learned an awful lot about the way people were doing business at that time. Obviously, the situation was different. The Saddam Hussein regime was centralizing corrupt payments, if you want. But I think I agree with the colleague from the government spokesman who is saying, well, it's not a new phenomenon. It's not that it's come in merely after the occupation. It's an old phenomenon, but
not being dealt with terribly well, it would seem.
No, what bothers me really well now is that one hasn't done away with it. One actually has even promoted corruption to some extent because it was useful during the occupation. And I think one tends to believe from outside that corruption is less bad than bloodshed. But frankly, one doesn't see the links between the issues. If a country is in the state that Iraq is at the moment, the trust in the public institutions is absolutely crucial. People have to start rebuilding in their heads, wholly apart from steals and money being lost and so on, and not being available to buy foodstuffs, as the issue was just with the last commerce minister. So I think one is dealing lightly with the issue of corruption. One is not seeing the links here. And now to your question, well, this is what we've seen nearly in every country with a heavy corruption situation. Take Nigeria, that as soon as somebody gets tough, he in order is accused of being corrupt himself. Nuhu Ribadu, the head of the anti-corruption unit in Nigeria, for instance.
Great point that Mark Piet brought up there, trust in public institutions. I'll ask Sabah Jawad in London, if there was a change in government with this with this election coming up, is that actually going to deal with the problem? Is there going to be trust in these new public institutions under a new government?
Well, that proposes actually that the government is going to be re-elected or is going to be replaced by another government. But I think the whole system in Iraq encourages corruptions, and actually all started. I know that I agree with people when they say corruption existed in Iraq before the occupation started in 2003. Corruption particularly started in Iraq after the impositions of the economic sanction against the Iraqi people in 1991. That led Saddam Hussein and his regime actually to concentrate some economic activities in the hand of his family and cronies, and that encourage and foster corruptions. But what's happening after 2003, we have an occupying power, which a lot of cash with a lot of $100 bills going around distributing it, corrupting people. They corrupted the political process in Iraq even before they occupied Iraq. They gave millions of pounds to opposition groups in London and America and Europe, and build all these stations, build all these newspapers, and so on. And this is the start of the corruption. And what a new administration took over, governing council in Iraq. In fact, members of the governing council went about occupying government buildings and using them as their private property. Saddam palaces were occupied, ministries were occupied, and so on. And that's create an atmosphere of grab and steal and things like that. And there's still
so let's get
some
the final
people
word
in the
then.
Government and political parties still occupy government properties.
Let's leave the
These
final word then, if you
properties
wouldn't
belong
mind,
to the
because we're
Iraqi
just
people,
running
do
out of
not
time.
belong to Saddam Hussein.
To Saad al-Mutalibi in Baghdad, I've got about a minute left. I just want you to briefly tell me, in a year's time, if I was to come back and interview you in a year's time about corruption, would there be a change?
Oh, definitely. We are heading into new elections, and the government is very aware that without dealing with such pressing issues, they will not be re-elected. This is a democratic system we live in. A government is very intense and determined to face this issue as facing services, as facing terrorism. The point is that within a year, I certainly hope that we will see progress. Now, to what level, to what percentage, I don't know. But it's very clear that if the government fails in dealing with these issues, they will not be re-elected. As simple as that. This is a democratic system, and we're very proud and very happy to live and work in such a transparent, democratic environment.
And we will look for those results, of course. My thanks to all our guests.
I do hope so.
Indeed. Saad al-Mutalibi in Baghdad, Mark Piet in Zurich, and Sabah Jawad in London. Thanks for all your thoughts, thanks for your time. And of course, you, our viewers, we always thank you for joining us for Inside Story. You can send a comment or a suggestion, if you'd like, to insidestory@aljazeera.net. That is our email address. But for now, from the whole team, it's goodbye for now.